In this episode, we're going to treat logging as a true security control, not just as technical clutter that lives in the background. Beginners often think of logs as something you look at only after a problem happens, like a forensic trail you follow when you are already in trouble. That is part of the story, but it is not the whole story. Logging, when designed intentionally, is a preventive and detective control that shapes how quickly you can discover issues, how confidently you can respond, and how well you can prove what happened. Without good logs, defenders are working in the dark, guessing about what happened and hoping their instincts are right. With good logs, defenders can turn uncertainty into evidence, detect suspicious behavior earlier, and measure whether controls are functioning the way they are supposed to. The key is that logging is not just about collecting a lot of data. It is about collecting the right data in the right way, so you can answer the questions that matter when something goes wrong. By the end of this, you should understand what to capture at a high level and why those categories of information are so important for security outcomes. A useful starting point is understanding what a security control is, because that framing helps you see logging as more than a record-keeping habit. A security control is something that reduces risk, either by preventing bad outcomes, detecting bad behavior, or helping the organization respond and recover. Logging supports detection by providing signals that something suspicious is happening, such as repeated failed logins or unusual access patterns. Logging supports response by providing timelines, affected assets, and evidence of attacker actions, which helps containment and eradication decisions. Logging also supports prevention indirectly because visibility changes behavior, helps identify weak controls, and enables continuous improvement. When you treat logging as a control, you start asking control-style questions, like what threat does this help detect? What decision will this log support? And what response will it enable? You also start thinking about effectiveness, such as whether the log is reliable, whether it is complete enough, and whether it is protected from tampering. This mindset shift is important because it pushes you away from logging everything and hoping it helps, and toward logging purposefully to create meaningful defensive capability. To decide what to capture, it helps to organize logging around the kinds of questions defenders need to answer. One set of questions is about identity and access, such as who did something, from where, and under what level of permission. Another set is about system activity, such as what processes ran, what services started, and what configuration changes occurred. Another set is about network behavior, such as what connections were made, what was allowed or blocked, and what unusual destinations appeared. Another set is about application behavior, such as what requests were received, what errors occurred, and whether sensitive actions were performed. Finally, defenders need context, such as time synchronization, asset identity, and environment details, because a log line without context can be meaningless. The goal is not to memorize a perfect list, but to understand that good logging creates a multi-angle view of reality. When something happens, you want to triangulate it from identity, host behavior, network behavior, and application behavior, so you can see both the actor and the effect. That is how logging becomes a control rather than a pile of disconnected records. Identity and authentication logging is one of the highest value categories because so many attacks begin with credential abuse or privilege misuse. Useful logs in this area show successful and failed authentication attempts, password changes, account lockouts, new account creation, role or permission changes, and unusual login patterns. They also include important context like the source of the attempt, the device or client involved, and whether multi-factor authentication was used. For beginners, the big idea is that identity is the key to the environment, and attackers often try to become someone they are not. If you cannot see authentication behavior clearly, you may miss early warnings like repeated failures followed by a success, or a privileged account logging in at an unusual time from an unusual location. Identity logs also help during response because they allow you to trace what an attacker did after gaining access, such as which systems were accessed and which permissions were changed. Another reason identity logs matter is accountability, because they support audits and investigations by tying actions to identities. When identity logging is missing or incomplete, teams may be forced to guess who performed a change or whether an action was authorized, and that uncertainty makes both security and operations weaker. System and endpoint logging is another high-value area because attackers often change systems in ways that create persistence or enable further activity. Useful system logs include events related to process execution, service starts and stops, software installation, configuration changes, and security control changes. They also include events related to user sessions, privilege elevation, and access to sensitive areas of the system. For beginners, you can think of system logs as answering the question of what happened on the machine, not just who logged in. If you see a suspicious process running, you want to know when it started, what started it, and what it did next. If you see a system setting change, you want to know who initiated it and whether it aligns with normal operations. System logs are also important because attackers may try to disable defenses, so visibility into security tool status and configuration is critical. The key is that system logs provide the story of behavior, which is often more useful than a single indicator. When collected and protected, they allow you to detect patterns that are hard to see through other sources. Network logging adds another angle, because even if you cannot see inside every system, you can often see communication patterns between systems and to the outside world. Useful network logs include firewall decisions, connection attempts, allowed and blocked traffic, and unusual spikes or deviations from typical flow. They can also include records of name resolution behavior, which can reveal unusual destinations or suspicious patterns. For beginners, the important idea is that attackers need to move information and control signals across networks, and those movements often leave traces. Network logs can show lateral movement, where an attacker spreads internally, and they can show data exfiltration attempts, where information is sent out. Network logging also supports containment because it helps teams decide what to block and where to isolate. Without network visibility, responders may isolate too broadly or too narrowly because they cannot see where the activity is going. Network logs also help validate segmentation because they can show whether boundaries are being enforced or whether internal systems are more open than intended. When network logging is combined with identity and system logs, you can connect who did something with where it traveled and what it touched. Application logging is where a lot of security reality lives, especially in modern environments where critical functions run through applications rather than through direct system access. Useful application logs include authentication events, access to sensitive functions, changes to critical records, unusual error patterns, and signs of input misuse. They can also include audit trails for key actions, such as administrative changes, data exports, or changes to access policies within the application. For beginners, the key idea is that applications represent business processes, and attackers often aim at business outcomes, like accessing customer data or manipulating transactions. If you only log system and network activity, you may miss the fine-grained story of what happened inside the application. Good application logs are also critical for impact assessment because they can show what records were accessed or changed. They also help with compliance and accountability because many organizations must prove who accessed certain data and when. Application logging requires thoughtful design because developers must decide which actions matter and how to record them in a consistent way. When done well, application logs turn business operations into a visible, auditable trail that supports both security and integrity. The value of logging depends heavily on log quality, because low-quality logs can be worse than no logs by creating false confidence. Good logs are time-synchronized, consistent in format, and include enough context to be interpretable later. Time synchronization matters because investigations rely on timelines, and if clocks drift, events appear out of order and conclusions become shaky. Consistent formatting matters because detection depends on comparing events and spotting patterns, and inconsistent logs make that harder. Context matters because logs without asset identifiers, user identifiers, or environment markers can be impossible to tie together. Another part of quality is completeness, meaning that critical events are captured reliably and not dropped during high load. Finally, logs should be protected because attackers often try to erase or alter logs to hide their actions. Protection includes controlling access to logs, centralizing collections so logs cannot be easily destroyed on a single system, and monitoring for signs of tampering. When you treat log quality as part of the control, you stop thinking of logging as a checkbox and start thinking of it as an engineered capability. Another beginner concept that helps is the trade-off between signal and noise, because capturing everything creates cost and confusion. Logs consume storage, they consume processing, and they create analysis work. So you need to capture what supports security decisions. High-signal logging focuses on events that represent meaningful change or meaningful access, such as privilege changes, authentication anomalies, and access to sensitive resources. Lower signal logging includes routine background events that rarely matter, and collecting too much of that can drown out the important signals. The answer is not to ignore detail entirely, because deep detail can be useful during investigations, but rather to separate what is needed for detection from what is needed for forensic depth. In practice, organizations often keep a baseline set of high-signal logs for alerting and day-to-day monitoring, while retaining richer logs for a limited time for investigation and audit. The key is to align logging choices with threat models and business priorities, rather than hoping that more data automatically means more security. When your logging strategy matches what you are trying to defend, analysis becomes faster and more accurate. When you connect all of this back to why logging matters, the main idea is that logging is how defenders observe reality over time. It turns invisible actions into visible records, and it allows teams to detect, investigate, respond, and learn with confidence. Logging supports incident handling because it provides evidence and timelines, and it supports prevention because it reveals weak points and control failures. It also supports accountability, audits, and trust because organizations can demonstrate what happened and what they did about it. For a beginner, the most important takeaway is that logs are not just technical artifacts. They are part of the defensive design of an environment. If you capture identity events, system behavior, network activity, and application actions in a purposeful way, you create the foundation for strong detection and response. If you ignore logging or treat it as a secondary concern, you will struggle to answer basic questions when incidents occur, and you will rely too much on guesswork. Treat logging as a security control, and you build a security program that can see, decide, and act based on evidence rather than hope.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.